Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on Twitter at Movies TV Mad, on Instagram at Movies TV Mad 555, and the same on TikTok. Welcome to Monday's edition of the DCEU Daily. Today we're going to go back in time and talk about Gavin O'Connor's Suicide Squad movie that never was. Gavin O'Connor says Warner Brothers regime change kills his Suicide Squad movie. They wanted a comedy. With Gavin O'Connor's Warrior recently celebrating its 10th anniversary, we recently sat down for an interview on the Playlist podcast to talk about the writer-director's standout sports drama, and while the focus was on Warrior and its potential television spin-off, the conversation did turn to past and future projects, including a discarded adaptation of Suicide Squad and an upcoming drama with O'Connor's Mayor of Easttown collaborator. So let's focus on the Suicide Squad. After all, this is the DCEU Daily. Before James Gunn was attached to direct the sequel/reboot of David Ayer's 2016 film, O'Connor had been asked to write a script for a Suicide Squad movie. Originally, the studio had wanted something a little darker in tone, and O'Connor had been tasked with creating something serious. What happened there was I wrote a deal to write a script, and they knew what I was writing at that level with those kinds of movies. With that budget, no one's just going off and writing something without walking them through what the movie's going to be. The director explained, and everyone was cool with it. Very interesting. But when O'Connor was in the final stages of the script writing process, there was a regime change at DC Films, and suddenly the studio was asking him for a distinctly different take than the one he was writing. What happened was, during the latter part of writing the script, there was a whole regime change at DC, and when that happened, they wanted it to be a comedy, he recalled. And I'm like, I'm not writing a comedy. I mean, it was fun, but it's not a yuck fest. And the new regime wanted a different movie than I was writing. Asked if he's seen the new Suicide Squad movie by James Gunn or has any other comic book characters in mind, the answer was a firm no. I have no interest to see it, to be honest, he said. And as for additional comic book movies, he said, I'm just doing my own thing. So he's been burnt. So he's clearly very, very unhappy. Now, when he talks about a regime change, I'm assuming he's talking about when Jeff Johns became creative officer of DC Comics, DC Entertainment, the whole lot. I think this is when it started. Since that experience, O'Connor acknowledges that he's more focused on original projects after working as an executive producer on Brad Ingleby's Mayor of Easttown. So I think that's pretty much it. But let's go into this. Let's get into this now. So he was writing a really dark, interesting, dramatic Suicide Squad movie, but the details are kind of scattered because there were always rumours about Black Adam being the villain. I think that's what Gavin was attempting to do. There was another character Gavin was thinking about, but he was also kind of thinking of introducing Supergirl to the Suicide Squad universe. I think she'd been taken, they had to go and rescue her, or something along those lines. So Gavin O'Connor is a very, very talented man. You don't get to produce Mayor of Easttown if you don't know what you're doing. And you know, HBO, that was bought by HBO, by the way, which is owned by Warner Brothers. So that connection is still there. And as I say, I feel that he's talking about the regime change because basically Snyder was running it, but then Jeff Johns took over, and then Jeff Johns and Snyder were all involved together. And it was clear that Johns sees DC in a very different way to Snyder. That's obvious. Not necessarily making sitcom movies, but brighter colour palettes, more, I suppose, brighter tone in narrative. And I mean, let's be clear here. The first Suicide Squad, not by David Ayer or by David Ayer, or who you want to kind of acclaim it, I mean, we may as well call that Jeff Johns' Suicide Squad. So we don't, you know, some people are calling it the Studio Squad. So the Studio Squad had humour in it, but I don't think it was hilariously funny or purposely trying to be made hilariously funny. I still think that movie's okay, but I will say this, that I think Gavin O'Connor would have given us something special, especially introducing Black Adam as the villain or Supergirl. needing rescuing from the Suicide Squad, I think it would have been very, very exciting and interesting, and I would have been down for that. But this is the problem with regime changes, isn't it? Because the mentality is different. Jeff Johns was allowed to come in and take over DC at that time because there was problems within the comic books and the movies. A lot of people were complaining about Man of Steel and the tone of BVS. So they didn't know which way to turn, and they thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's just do what the MCU are doing. But they never really did what the MCU were doing. Justice League is not anything like, the first Avengers movie that Joss Whedon wrote and directed, co-wrote and directed, So it's not like they copy and pasted the MCU in a good way, but you can't copy and paste the MCU. Nobody knows the ingredients to Coca-Cola. That's why kind of every time you have another company's cola, it doesn't quite taste the same. And obviously that was the same with Justice League and other movies. If they only allowed David Ayer to make his movie, and I don't know if Gavin O'Connor, I think Gavin wasn't he making a Suicide Squad sequel? A lot of people were tasked by Warner Brothers to make a Suicide Squad sequel. But maybe they're not talking about Jeff Johns, maybe they're talking about Walter Hamada. Maybe, because it was Walter Hamada who appointed James Gunn to write and direct his own movie, and Gunn didn't want to do anything else but Suicide Squad. Now, I really enjoyed the Suicide Squad. I don't think it was overly hilarious, but you can identify a James Gunn film very quickly. You know that he did Scooby-Doo. You know that he did the Guardians movies. Without even knowing he did them, he has a signature. And it's not there's not much difference to that. The only difference between the Suicide Squad and Guardians is that obviously a lot more people died in the Suicide Squad, and it was R-rated, and there was a lot more blood and guts. Apart from that, it's got his signature. It's got a group of people walking from the distance looking very, very confident and things like that. The gags are the same. It's James Gunn. I do feel that James Gunn has only one way of working. I mean, that's how I see it. I do think he's a one-trick pony. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and if you don't know how to make films in a different way, some directors do. I've seen directors, Richard Donner did The Omen, then he did Superman the movie. You couldn't have two different ways of making a movie and showing a movie. And so Richard Donner wasn't a one-trick pony. Omen, Superman, the Lethal Weapon series, Scrooged, Goonies, so this guy had a great variety of talent, but I don't think that James Gunn has. If you're asking me what I would have preferred, Gavin O'Connor. Gavin O'Connor was writing something compelling and interesting, and I would have really wanted to see it. Bringing in James Gunn to do a Suicide Squad is like an admittance of defeat. It's like, all right, let's bring in this Marvel director. He's popular. He'll make us money. I was very happy about it at first because I thought we just need a movie to be successful at this point. I think that's the way I looked at it, and that's why I got so excited. And I don't hate the Suicide Squad. Far from it. But it's not like bringing Gunn in or doing that formula actually, won us anything at the global box office. Let's be honest about it. The fleeting box office, and when you see other movies doing so well, you can't even argue it's the pandemic, really. In America you can argue about day and date, and globally it's a lot more healthier, but not that more healthier. And also, to be fair to James, I think the Suicide Squad IP, as we keep on saying every single day here, isn't very popular, but I think this was a good film. And to introduce Supergirl in that way would have been awesome and compelling. Now we're going to introduce a version of Supergirl in the Flash movie. And that brings me to my next point. What is the multiverse strategy going to be? Is it going to be this Marvel, fun, fast-moving, gags when people die and things like that? Or are we actually going to get a great, interesting take? I'm very interested what happens when Barry Allen goes to this new kind of darker universe and he meets Michael Keaton's Batman. Is this going to be a darker, brutal world? I hope so. I hope so, because that's what Flashpoint is. The Flashpoint universe is darker than Barry's universe. It's unfair. You've got the Atlantean and the Amazonian War we were discussing yesterday. So I want to see that. Because it's interesting, though, because Barry Allen has come from a darker DCEU. Now it's interesting because Justice League isn't that dark, and that's really where we first see the character in his glory, aka Ezra Miller's The Flash. Although we see him in a flash in BVS as well. And I like that CCTV footage. I think the CCTV footage was a good idea, in my humble opinion. But I do think you still need to represent dark worlds, especially in a Flashpoint movie. That's the whole point of Flashpoint. It's like Back to the Future 2 when he goes back to the alternate 1985. It's the same story, it's the same concept. It's a darker world. Jesus Christ, Biff Cannon is a billionaire. He cheated his way to money, and it's partly Marty's fault. And this Earth that Barry Allen's going to find himself in has been constructed mostly because of what Barry's done by going back in time. In fact, the Flashpoint world is more Barry's fault than the alternate 1985 is Marty McFly's fault. Because although Marty McFly, grabs the almanac and then it's grabbed by old Biff, partly old Biff kind of manipulated that situation as well. But this is on Barry Allen, and he has to fix this, although he'll never fix this. Because once he goes back in time, even when he attempts to fix the world, as we know, that reboots the entire multiverse and makes the DCEU very, very different. Which is a fascinating concept, by the way, and this is why the MCU are doing it as well. But yeah, I mean, look, when you've got people like Gavin O'Connor, and he's writing something real and raw and dark and dramatic, you don't ask him to do a fucking sitcom. But then I'll say that the first Suicide Squad wasn't actually a sitcom. We have a big problem now in comic book movies because everyone can see the MCU isn't going anywhere. Whatever shit they print, people go out to watch it, right? There's no question about that. And as a studio, what you do, you go towards the cash. But as I've spoken about Coca-Cola, no one can make Coca-Cola like Coca-Cola, and no one can make Marvel movies like the MCU and fake. Now, it's not because the Marvel movies are great movies or they're great cinema. It's easy, digestible, really sweet gum that people enjoy chewing. But the only people who know how to make that really lovely, sweet, digestible gum are Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige. And that's the thing. And this is why you shouldn't attempt to do what they're doing, and you should just do their own thing. And I think this is very interesting now, because Walter Hamada has gone for James Gunn. So is his mentality going to be the same with kind of this multiverse strategy? So I'm very interested to see how we go at this. These are concerning situations because going with the Marvel formula didn't work with Justice League. It didn't work with James Gunn's The Suicide Squad in terms of the financial viability of it. So what direction are we going in now? Now, it's interesting because he did greenlight the Batman. I mean, I think that was a studio kind of greenlighting rather than a Walter Hamada one. But the Batman is going to be a brutally dark film. And I'm very interested about that because that proves that if you're willing to have a movie like The Batman or have Gotham PD on HBO Max, that means you're happy to mix it up a bit. And this is exactly what we need. We need to see the colourful colour palettes. We want to see the colourful narrative tones. But sometimes we need the Batman as well. We need a Gotham PD. And I think it's important that we do have variety to the DC live action content. And with Batman, that proves it. That means you can have a Suicide Squad movie done by James Gunn. Lighter, but lots of killing, blood and guts. It's just kind of a Tarantino does Suicide Squad, really. And it's very fun, and it's very cool. But there should be space for people like Snyder, Matt Reeves. I think that's very important as well. And by having a movie like The Batman, it proves that they're willing to go down that darker direction. So that excites me, and it's not so worrying, but we're going to have to wait and see. But this, not allowing Gavin O'Connor, a talented creative like Gavin O'Connor, to actually make a great movie is somewhat disappointing because I would have loved to have seen his take. As I say, I think he was doing a sequel, not the first movie. But we all know the truth. David Ayer should have been allowed to do his Gotham City Sirens, his Birds of Prey, and his Suicide Squad sequel. It's as simple as that. Why do I love Michael Shannon Zod as a villain? Why do I think he's probably the best villain in comic book movie history. And there's some great villains out there, but I think he's the very, very best. Well, you've got to understand the history of this character, pre-Man of Steel, to understand where the character's coming from. First of all, he's a clone. So when you're cloned, right, by the Kryptonians, you already have a task. You know what you're going to be doing. So there's a limited amount of free will. So obviously he can think, he can talk for himself, but his predisposition is to be a military person. Then he becomes a military leader, and what he does through his younger life before we meet him, he's literally as much as of the protector of Krypton as Superman in the future will be the protector of Earth. He pretty much is Superman on Krypton. So this is a pure man that just wants to protect his people and his home. But he slowly sees the corruption in the Kryptonian Council. Just like we do, we see the corruption in our governments and our local MPs and our local congressmen or wherever you're from. We see the corruption, we see them taking bribes, making decisions to take away our very freedoms, and we don't have a choice in the matter. We pay our taxes, we just want to lead a good life, have a good time, and they keep on stopping us and they keep on infringing of the enjoyment of our lives. And this is what he sees. It's actually the Kryptonian Council that causes the destruction of Krypton. Because, as Jor-El says in the movie, they used to explore space. They used to find other worlds. They had a world engine. They were using it to kind of redesign these other planets. So Krypton was exploring the vast, solar system out there. That's why they had so much information about it. But then they stopped doing that, and they created this artificial population control. And this is where things went wrong. And somehow, and don't ask me for the details, something went wrong and they were damaging the planet. And it was too late, as Jor-El says. And Zod's seeing this happening, and he's frustrated. And this is when we meet him in Man of Steel, where he literally actually kills a member of the council who says to him, "And who gave you authority? Who gave this authority?" I did. Because basically I'm fed up the way this world is working. That's how he's thinking. And he wants to just get rid of all of them and start again. But Zod is a dictator. He is going about things the wrong way. But in his heart, he can see they're no better. And they're dictators too. And it is the artificial population control that's the problem. But also, Zod believes in all of this. This is the hypocrisy and the irony of villains and dictators who claim they're there to create a better world. Because when Jor-El announces that they've had a child, aka Kal-El, one day Superman and Clark Kent, is the first natural birth in, Yonks on Krypton, he calls Jor-El out for this, doesn't he? And he gets very upset. So he actually believes in the system that destroyed Krypton, but he still killed the Kryptonian Council for inciting kind of the artificial population control. So there's irony in that, and this is the hypocrisy you'll find not only in governments, but in vicious dictators like Zod. So there's a lot of reality there. So they ruin their own world because they didn't listen to people like Jor-El. It's a bit like on our world. And I think this is what Goyle was going for when people say, well, listen, the environment's being damaged every day. We're going to flood. We're going to burn to death. This is serious and nobody's listening. Everyone's living in denial. One day we're all screaming to the hills saying, help us. Well, it's a bit too late. We didn't listen. This is the real commentary of Man of Steel and of General Zod, because ironically, he comes to Earth to create Krypton, right? So his world didn't work. He wants to do this. He wants to make the same mistakes they made on there and bring back Krypton and the Kryptonians. Nothing will be different, and Earth will be destroyed as well, because Zod hasn't learnt the mistakes of the Kryptonian from the mistakes of the Kryptonian Council. So there's the moral lesson there. There's the commentary in Man of Steel. But what I love about this, you've got to kind of notice it. Not everyone noticed that. So you can still enjoy the great visuals and Superman and Lois and the fighting and the great CGI that Zack Snyder gave us, and the other stories with Jonathan Kent and the way he brings Clark up. So there's lots of different aspects to this film, and it is a fun alien invasion movie as well. So that's another great, stunning, compelling element of it. And so, but there is a deeper commentary in that film, and it is about environmental commentary. Well, and I really like that, because I think environmental commentary is more important than identity politics, but a lot of people don't like, because some people passionately don't believe there's a problem with our environment on the planet Earth, and you know, that everything that these people are warning against isn't going to happen. They're deniers. They're living in denial. And most of these people, and I hate to get political here, are from the right wing. I'm not saying they're wrong or right. Well, I am saying they're wrong. Because there is a problem with our environment. This planet is dying. It's been dying since I was a little boy. Since they were telling us not to use certain types of deodorants. But it goes beyond that. The pollution, man, right, or let's not get the feminists on me, humanity has damaged its own world. But it's not really our world, because, you know, the planet Earth was here before us. But the point being, we are destroying the planet we're living on. The Kryptonians were destroying the planet they were living on. And Zod wanted to change that, even though he didn't like the fact that Kal-El was the first natural birth. But what he wanted was the Codex, just so he could recreate Krypton. So, you know, he wanted the Codex when, you know, he incited this insurrection against the Kryptonian Council. I don't know what his plan was, because he claims he agreed with Jor-El that the planet was being destroyed. So obviously, he was planning on leaving Krypton and looking for a new world. Ultimately, he gets banished to the Phantom Zone, and when Krypton gets destroyed, you know, him and his people get freed, and then obviously Clark sets off a pulse that leads him to Earth. So if Clark wasn't on Earth, none of this is going to happen. So again, you know, Jor-El has kind of incited this thing accidentally, but it's still because he sent Kal there that the problem begins. And so ultimately, the reason Zod is such a great villain is because he has a direction. He has motivations. He's not twirling his moustache. He doesn't want to kill people. When he kills his friend Jor-El, Michael Shannon does a great thing. You can see the regret in his face and his eyes. But then he tells Superman, Kal-El, you know, your father was very honourable. He had an honourable death, or however he says it. And, you know, Kal says, you killed him? And he goes, yes. And I haven't regretted anything I've ever done more. But if I had to do it again, I would. This is a man of honour, but a man of conscience as well. So he didn't take any pleasure. Now there's a second situation where he has to say goodbye to Jor-El, and you can see the great acting in Shannon's face again. So obviously Jor-El's got this kind of false ghost. He kind of projects through the Kryptonian ship by using the kind of Kryptonian element. And obviously, you know, Michael Shannon's fed up of listening to him and him trying to stop him. So he gets the computer, the ship in the computer, to kind of wipe him out. So when he vanishes, you see the regret in Shannon's face. He knew he had to do it, you know, to succeed in his mission. But Jor-El was his best friend for all those years on Krypton, and they worked together. It's that great moment in the opening of the movie when Jor-El, you know, when Zod goes, please, I don't want us to be enemies. Zod actually says that. Even though he's doing what he's doing, he doesn't want to kill Jor-El. He doesn't want them to be enemies because he knows what that means. And ultimately, they did kind of become enemies. But I do believe that Jor-El and Zod still, deep down, had a great respect and admiration and love for each other. And I think if you look for these things in these films, like Snyder's dceu films, as we were discussing yesterday, the depth of emotion, the depth of feeling, the nuances from the Bible and things like that, they're very smart. You won't find things like this in the MCU, and that's fine. You know, people just want to, you know, chew that sweet gum, as I was talking about earlier. And this is what makes Zod, Michael Shannon, such a great villain. And I mean, people talk about Heath Ledger, and I understand what Heath Ledger's Joker's motivation is. He wants to prove that we are as bad as he is, right? As fucked up as he is. And in a way, he's right. In fact, the public may be worse than the murderers and the killers out there, because we all have this survival instinct. We all do terrible things to each other every day. But then we talk about other people. This is what we do. And I understand the motivations of Ledger's Joker. It's a great performance. He's a great Joker and it works. But there's something better about Shannon's Zod. And this is why I think he's the best comic book movie villain. And I think about all the comic book movie villains and I can't think of any better. I mean, we go back to Superman the movie. No. We go back to Superman 2. I mean, General Zod in that film was fun and interesting, and Kneel Before Zod's great, but again, there's not really a broader motivation. Superman 3, well, Robert Vaughn's villain's pretty shit. Superman 4, Nuclear Man and Lex Luthor, so that doesn't work. Lex Luthor in Superman Returns actually has better motivations than Dick Donner's Lex Luthor has. I mean, he still wants to get the land and everything, but at least he's got this hatred for Superman, and his main motivation of the film is to kill Superman. So at least that's something a lot better. Then we go to the MCU, and I'm thinking about all the villains in the MCU, and apart from Thanos, and, you know, I can't even think of anyone. They're not that interesting. So, and I mean, I think we can go, and maybe the only competition for Michael Shannon Zod is Bryan Singer's X-Men movies. I think Magneto's great, especially in the first and second film. So you could probably say that it's out of Michael Shannon Zod or Magneto from Singer's X-Men, definitely. And maybe I'd even say Magneto maybe is slightly better than Zod, but I still prefer Shannon Zod's motivations. He's only interested in serving his people, protecting his people, you know, using the Codex to rebuild Krypton. It's not the right thing to do, but all this man was born to do was protect his planet and his people. And that's his motivation. And he gets offended by anyone who tries to stop him from doing that. And, you know, I just like it in the end when that mission is foiled by Superman and he's a broken man. I love the speech before him and Superman have the final third act fight, when they're standing in the, you know, in the charred remains of the Battle of Metropolis, and he says, you know, the only thing I ever wanted to do was to protect my people. And this is the most compelling, heartbreaking moment. But now I have no people. So he's broken now. He has no aim, he has no mission. So he's gonna go fucking mad. So this is what he says. So I'm gonna kill all these people you protect, Cal, because he wants to hurt him. And then he says later on, either you die or I die, Cal, because there's nothing left. He wants to kill Cal now. He actually hates him now. When they first meet, he goes, let's not, you know, this is a great reunion. He just wants to do things peacefully at first. But when he realizes that Jor-El's messing with him from the grave, and that Superman is stopping him, and sometimes quite effectively, and then he gets nastier and nastier, because all he wants to do in his mind is protect his people and serve his people, and by using the Codex on planet Earth and, you know, these world engines, that's what he's doing. And this is why I think he's the best comic book villain. I mean, we didn't grow up with many great villains, but this is a great villain, because as I say, he's not just evil for being evil. He has a purpose, he has a motivation. I understand his frustration with the Kryptonian Council, because it's something that us as ordinary working class people have with our own governments all the time, and we're waving our fists at the screen half the time, but we would never do anything like Zod did, and I'm not suggesting that what Zod did was right. But what is right about Zod is his frustrations. But he's gone too far, he's too angry now. He's served his people and his planet for years in the Kryptonian Council, and they've manipulated them. You know, when you see that the exploration stopped and they brought in the artificial, you know, the artificial humanization, or whatever you want to call it, creating artificial cloned Kryptonians, that was very bad, and that signed the planet's death warrant. So no wonder Jor-El, you know, and Zod are upset. But Jor-El's a man of science and a man of peace, so he uses science to solve this problem. Well, he can't save Krypton. All he can do is send his son. But he doesn't just send his son to save his life. He sends his son with the Codex. He really wants kind of, you know, Cal to do what Zod's doing, but in a more peaceful way. But is there a peaceful way? By using the Codex. Well, this is what David Goyer was going to do in Man of Steel 2 in his sequel. And it's a shame we never got that. Hopefully one day we will, because seeing the Codex being used by Cal, because these life forms are already inside him. So eventually they can be born, or however it works. And in fact, Brainiac might find a way to harvest the billions of Kryptonian cells inside Superman. So that's something I always wanted to see, and I think Goya is a really sharp writer. The commentary in this film, the way he wrote Zod and Superman really works for me. And as I say, maybe you can find me a better villain than Michael Shannon's General Zod. And I mean, if we go down the realms of, you know, Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, then yeah, there's competition there. I think definitely Magneto, so Ian McKellen's Magneto, Michael Shannon's Zod, and Joaquin Phoenix's Joker are definitely up there for me in the top 3 or 4. And then you've got Nicholson's Joker, he has to be up there as well. And obviously Ledger's Joker, all up there. So you look at these villains and they're all DC. Now maybe that's my DC biased. And I mean, Thanos is great, but I still don't think he's up there with the people I've just named. He's good. And I mean, you could whack anyone half decent in the MCU as a villain and it would look good. But at the end of the day, the MCU have a villain problem. They've always had a villain problem. And I suspect they always will. But in Spider-Man No Way Home, we've got Doc Ock. We've probably got William Dafoe's Green Goblin, which are really great comic book villains. Again, you could put them up with the ones I've mentioned from DC, and you could choose any of them to be the greatest. They're all great villains. But for me, I mean, when I look at Green Goblin, even William Dafoe's Green Goblin, you know, and I understand his kind of motivations, but still, the motivations that Michael Shannon's Zod come from are originally from a pure place. And it's the same kind of rules that Nolan and Goya did with The Dark Knight and, you know, Harvey Dent and Harvey Two-Face. Sometimes we live long enough to become the villain. And that's the thing, we can start at a good place. Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight starts from a good place, but then his soul is ripped away from him purposely by Heath Ledger's Joker to prove a point that even a good man can become vindictive and evil. Do you see it? That's the motivation. And all these great villains and motivations are from DC villains. So we may never have had this 20-30 cohesive franchise that makes billions and billions of dollars. But that's not important, not to me. And it shouldn't be to you. Because DC movies have been great. I grew up with some great Superman movies. I've seen great Batman movies. The Snyderverse was absolutely beautiful. And Michael Shannon's Zod is the greatest comic book movie villain of all time, and that's my opinion. Now, I mean, Black Mask in Birds of Prey is good, but I wouldn't put him up there with the villains I've spoken about. Again, what's his motivation? That he's some toxic male? That's it, with no motivations, no reasonings? No. I'll allow the extreme left to do that, and we'll talk about villains all the time, whenever I'm on or whenever I want to talk about this again, that actually have purpose, that actually have motivations. This has been the DCEU Daily. I'm Mick, your host with the most. Just ask your girlfriends and your wives. I will be back again in the next edition of the DCEU Daily, and please, my views are terrible, my likes are terrible. Please help me out. If you can, like, share and subscribe. Comment down below, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.